So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jonathan Portis. I'm Senior Fellow at UK in a Changing Europe, and I'll be chairing this discussion today. Unfortunately, Sarah Hall is unwell and has hence had to cancel. I'm sorry about that, but nonetheless, I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic economists from our rival think tanks, but none the worse for that. Hannah Slaughter from the Resolution Foundation and Xiaowei Xu from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, both of whom have produced a variety of excellent analyses on particularly on aspects of the labor market and how it is changed during and after the pandemic and during the current economic turbulence. So the title today of today is sort of Unpacking the Cost of Living Crisis. First, just some housekeeping. If you have any questions, please do use the Slido link, which should be available to everybody. Please do post your questions on Slido. We will be taking them from there. So that's and you can post them at any time. You can also, I think, upvote or upvote and hence amplify other people's questions, which will make them more likely to take them. Where are we now? I mean, I think that it was, I think, from a sort of political economy point of view, quite interesting to see that the way that the cost of living crisis became this sort of universally accepted shorthand for the economic period that we entered in after the pandemic. That is representing a sort of period when the inflation was perceived as the country's primary economic problem because of the impact it was having on real wages, the value of people's incomes, and hence on living standards. We are now, as inflation is now clearly falling, and I think, notwithstanding the difficulty in making economic forecasts, I think it would be a very, very brave economist indeed who would bet against inflation continuing to fall quite quickly over the coming months. Real wages are, in a sort of technical sense, but we'll come on to this in much more detail, are rising. But of course, that conceals a huge amount of disparity between different people and different groups. Will we still be talking about the cost of living crisis in a few months when perhaps inflation has come down quite a lot more, or will we come up with some new name for it? Because I suspect, again, we will discuss this, that even as inflation falls, that doesn't mean that there will be a universal feel-good factor across the whole economy. I don't think we'll be talking about booming Britain by Christmas or even next year, although, again, forecasts can be wrong. I think we'll talk a bit about both what has happened over the last couple of years and what we should take from that, but in particular, looking forward, what can we expect? What things should we be focusing on so we try and work out the impact of changes in the general economy and the sort of the big macro variables on individuals and households and their experience of the economy. So with that, I think that's enough for me. And I'll now ask both Hannah and Xiaowei to say a few words to kick us off. As I said, please do post your questions in the box. So let me go first, just because she's top of the screen, to Hannah.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, the cost of living crisis obviously kind of been the big thing that's dominated lots of the economic news over the past years, and there's far more aspects and kind of angles to that than are than I'll talk about now, but kind of just to reflect a bit on kind of where we are. I mean, it's obviously not news to anyone that we've kind of had this, long period of very high inflation, peaking at around 10-11%, although now thankfully on its way down. I mean, it's obviously worth bearing in mind that that's, even as inflation does start to come down, we're still very much left with the legacy of the cost of living crisis, both in terms of the fact that even if inflation, the rate of change in prices is falling, we're still left with far higher levels of prices than we had a couple of years ago, especially in energy and more recently other essentials as well, like food, which has kind of been a real pinch on lots of household living standards. But also, obviously, in kind of trying to deal with the high cost of living and bring inflation back down, we've had policy changes, particularly from the Bank of England, and kind of increasing interest rates. So that's kind of had kind of other effects, particularly for households with mortgages who are now starting to face higher rates of payment on their mortgages. In terms of kind of who has been the most affected by this, so there's kind of, again, there's been quite a lot in the news over the last couple of years around kind of how much low income households are really at the sharp end of this, particularly because of the nature of the rise in prices, again, kind of starting particularly with the shock in energy prices, but also especially kind of in the more recent stages of the crisis, affecting things like food as well, and low-income households are much more affected by that, not only because they kind of spend a higher proportion of their budget on essentials than higher income households, but also because they are less likely to be able to kind of make changes to their spending and kind of switch away to cheaper products, or kind of cut down or cut back on their spending, because basically they're already doing that. And then I suppose kind of thinking about the kind of the labour market angle specifically, I mean, obviously the kind of high cost of living has meant that even though we've seen pretty fast growth in kind of pay in cash terms, particularly over the last year or so, which kind of the Bank of England in particular has been kind of worried about for separate reasons, that kind of might drive further rises in prices down the line. But kind of even kind of taking it at face value, that high growth in nominal wages, wages in cash terms, has only managed to outpace inflation kind of year on year very recently, and that's kind of compounded the 15 years of real wage stagnation that the workforce has been seeing since the financial crisis. And then I guess the final thing to say is that things have been kind of worse for some groups in the labour market. One group that I'd maybe bring out before we kind of get into the full discussion is the workers in the public sector, who have not seen as high growth as workers in the private sector, in part because of kind of government policy changes or kind of pay freezes in the public sector from a couple of years ago, that are now kind of really holding back public sector wages. There's lots more I could say, but I think I will stop talking for now and hand over to Xiaowei for some initial reflections.
Okay.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I guess there's not a huge amount to add after your introductions. I guess one thing I'd say is that I think the cost of living crisis has become this catch-all term to refer to anything related to inflation, but of course there's like different elements going on, as both Hannah and Jonathan have sort of drawn out. So the most obvious thing is, wages not keeping up with inflation. So despite the fact that we've had really quite decent nominal wage rises since the pandemic started, it's only very recently that real wages have started to tick up, so that those rises have started to outpace inflation. But of course, as Hannah said, there's also the impact of the Bank of England's interest rate rises to quell inflation, and that's obviously had an impact on people's living standards as well. As someone who's recently bought a house, I know that interest rates have gone up massively. So they're about like 2.5% back at the start of 2022. Now they're averaging 6% for a 2-year fix. And that's obviously taken a huge toll on people's disposable incomes, especially sort of people my age, people in their 30s, who are, getting on the housing ladder and have like really quite big mortgages. I guess one thing that hasn't been touched on yet, and as someone from the IFS with my IFS hat on, I can't not talk about tax. So partly as a result of inflation, we've also seen this massive rise in tax. And that's because back in April 2021, income tax thresholds were frozen in in nominal terms. And, at that time, no one thought that inflation would be hitting 10%. But given the very sharp rise in inflation, we've seen that's had a much bigger effect on the tax take than was originally envisaged. I was just pulling some numbers for another presentation just now, and one really shocking figure that stood out was that just this year alone, median earnings pre-tax be about 2% higher than before the pandemic, which is not great for 3.5 years of growth. But because of this increase in tax that we've seen, post-tax earnings are actually only 0.5% higher than before the pandemic. So this tax rise is also having a huge effect. I think finally, just to broaden things out a little bit, obviously we've been focusing on the impact of inflation when we talk about the cost of living crisis, but there's also been interesting changes going on within the labour market that's perhaps masked by this focus on the cost of living. So we've seen this jobs boom after the pandemic, as well as a rise in inactivity, sort of pushing up nominal wages up until now. We now see the labour market starting to cool, but also even in the period up to now, sort of labour market tightness is affecting different parts of the market differently, with pay grade differently for different types of people. So it'd be good to sort of touch on that as well.
So I think there's lots and lots that have come out of both of those, but I think one really interesting point to highlight is the one that Xiaowei just made about the slightly deceptive impression one gets if one looks at headline wages or even headline real wages. I remember that back when I was even younger than you two are now, which believe me is an awful long time, at the Treasury in the late 1980s, the Chancellor was very keen on focusing on something called the TPI, which I'm not sure whether it's published anymore, but it's the Tax and Prices Index, which said, well, what is the value of, what's the right way to deflate wages if you actually take into account the impact of direct taxes? Because at that time, of course, the government was cutting income taxes quite regularly. So the TPI actually gave a higher figure for quote real unquote wage growth than the ordinary RPI deflator would. But now we are in the opposite situation, where actually simply looking at headline real wages doesn't take account of the fact that actually before you get to actually spend your devalued pay packet, your hugely increased in nominal terms pay packet, but devalued by inflation, you also have an extra chunk that's being taken out of it by taxes. And so that presumably means that in terms of the value of net after-tax wages, we have still got a ways to go before people are actually seeing that they have more money in their pocket, more real money in their pockets, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And the income tax threshold freeze in particular, that's a policy that was meant to run out, I think, in 24. It's now been extended to 27. Maybe it's 25 rather than 24. But either way, it's going to keep going for a really long time. And really, by the end of the period it's been fixed, it will really have eroded most of the rise in real earnings that we'll see.
In terms of what else the government is doing about this, one of the announcements from the Chancellor yesterday was that the national living wage, as it's called, or the minimum wage, as I think most of us would still refer to it, to avoid being confused with the sort of voluntary living wages that are prevalent around the country, would increase by a minimum of about 6%, I think, to about £11 next year. This is, I think, in advance of the actual formal recommendation from the Low Pay Commission, What sort of impact is that likely to have?
Well, I think from our point of view at Resolution Foundation, obviously we've kind of said before, we're very much in favour of kind of these continued increases in the minimum wage. It's very much been a kind of big success story of the last, well, I mean, even the last couple of decades, 25 years. I mean, you know, it's massively improved living standards for lots of low paid workers. And this is kind of, although the Chancellor slightly preempted the kind of formal process, it's kind of very much in line with what we were expecting in terms of the kind of the government's kind of longer term target to raise the minimum wage to 2/3 of typical earnings by next year. So it's definitely kind of a really welcome thing, and will help lots of lower earners. I mean, I guess one thing to say is it's definitely not a silver bullet. It's definitely, you know, it can't do everything. Firstly, because obviously, like, not everyone is in work, so there's kind of and you know, there needs to be additional kind of support there through the benefit system. But even kind of for those who are in work, you know, it's the minimum wage is an hourly rate. So if people aren't, you know, if people can't get the number of hours that they want to work in a week, then that doesn't, you know, it might not mean that their weekly pay, which is ultimately what matters for their living standards, is going up, which is not to kind of take away from the success and the kind of benefits of raising the minimum wage, but just, you know, it's not the only thing we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about it in the round as kind of one way of supporting household incomes.
I think sort of zooming out, just to add to what Hannah said, I think, you know, as Hannah said, the government's got a target of hitting 2/3 of median wages by next year. So, you know, it had already committed to having a big rise in the national living wage before yesterday's announcement, and actually it'll probably have to go up by more than £11 an hour to get that target, presumably. But sort of in the longer run, the bigger picture is just a lack of wage growth across the economy, right? So we've seen this very long period of stagnation that I'm sure everyone's heard too much about since the financial crisis, a huge drop in the rate of growth from about, you know, 2.5% in the years before the financial crisis to less than 1% now, which, you know, accumulating over decades is leading to a huge gap in disposable incomes of, you know, 40% compared to where we would have been had pre-2008 trends continued. And the minimum wage has been an effective way to raise wages at the bottom. But, you know, the bigger question is, are we going to be stuck in this sort of low growth period for decades to come, or are there going to be ways to raise wages that are less sort of forced than just, you know, raising the minimum wage at the bottom?
So, I mean, that sort of takes us on to that. And perhaps the best way of thinking, so what, you know, obviously that stagnation, you know, conceals a huge disparity, you know, a degree of disparity between different groups, different sectors, different regions, different types of people, different age groups, and so on. What would you, both of you, I know, have looked at this, what are the sort of key trends that we've been seeing both over that period of stagnation in aggregate, but also in particular since the post-pandemic period, and what do might those tell us about the future? I don't know who wants to go first.
I can take a stab. So actually I think that stagnation has sort of prevailed across the economy. So it's not the case, you know, in the period since the financial crisis that we've seen top wages pulling away and the rest of the economy suffering. It seems quite different from the US, where, you know, the sort of productivity like wage gap is coming from the distribution. Here, measures of inequality have stayed, you know, similar or even decreased over that period. The problem is that everyone's wages have stopped growing. Sort of thinking about the period since the pandemic per se, I mean, to be honest, like partly, like, I'm not sure how much to trust any of the data because every data set gives you a different answer. But at least going by the administrative PAYE data and the average weekly earnings series, which is sort of the official, you know, updated wage series, it does seem like it's actually people in high paid professional jobs, so people in finance, professional services, IT, who've seen bigger earnings growth since the pandemic started. Now that could seem quite surprising because we keep hearing about all these labour shortages in low paid sectors, right? Everyone's going on about the lack of construction workers and, you know, drivers, people working in hospitality, but actually these sectors don't seem to have seen much earnings growth. And it's possible, sort of looking at trends in hours worked, that actually the adjustment there is coming from a decrease in hours as employers, you know, fail to recruit the number of people they need at the wage rates that can sustain their demand. So it sort of seems like, yeah, they're adjusting on the hours margin rather than the wages.
I mean, I think this is a really important point, and one that I think was sort of first spotted by you in particular, Xiaowei. That you know, there was a huge amount of noise around labor shortages immediately after the pandemic, also related by many people to Brexit and the end of free movement, because those sectors, partly, you know, coincidentally, but as it happened, were also the ones that where people where European workers were often a key source of labor, and yet. And I cannot count the number of people who shouted at me on Twitter, well, yes, but, you know, of course, ending free movement will push up wages. It's supply and demand, you idiot. It's basic economics. And yet we don't seem to see that in the data, which I think is quite an important point. It does not seem to have resulted in the sort of relative wage adjustment that we might have expected in the short term. I mean, I think I would tend to relate at least part of that to something that I was at a round table with Hannah's colleagues at the Resolution Foundation this morning, talking about trade. And I think one of the sort of key things that that seem to be emerging about post-Brexit trade patterns is that, as expected, Brexit has had some, although there's plenty of dispute about how large, a negative impact on UK's trade in goods, but UK service exports have held up remarkably well. And there's no evidence as yet of, or at least the consensus seems to be that there's no clear evidence of Brexit damage. And meanwhile, the broader structural factors that have been advantaging UK service exports have continued to operate, meaning that people in sectors like finance, business services, higher education, I might add, consultancy, creative industries, film, etc., are doing quite well. And that may account for the fact that it's those sectors that seem to be doing quite well in pay terms. But one question which maybe I'll throw back to you, Hannah, is, well, what does, if that's the case, if that's the sort of structural trends, what challenges does that pose to policymakers who presumably want to level up, not just regionally, but between different groups of people, different skill levels, different sectors, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can't pay myself as a trade or Brexit expert, but it's, you know, to the extent that we're seeing kind of big inequality between sectors, I mean, it's obviously a puzzle. I mean, it's also a puzzle because, you know, the minimum wage, as we've talked about, the minimum wage has been going up quite a lot, and you'd expect that, you know, in sectors like hospitality, where, you know, got quite, you know, relatively high proportions of minimum wage workers, you'd expect that to be kind of showing up in some way and kind of stronger kind of earnings growth. We haven't really seen much of that. There's obviously lots of other stuff going on beneath the surface in terms of kind of like the kind of composition of different sectors and what kinds of workers are there. But yeah, I mean, I think it's I mean, the kind of the trends that we're seeing post-COVID, I think is, it's really highlighting like that there is kind of massive amounts of inequality in our labour market between kind of, between different sectors, to some extent between different regions, depending on the kind of the mix of different jobs there are. It's, obviously levelling up in a kind of geographical sense is very much in the news of late, and kind of, that's obviously a far longer term trend than just the pandemic. But I think with the kind of, especially in the in that kind of initial opening up phase, in kind of summer autumn 2021, it was kind of a really kind of acute and visible problem, partly because lots of people were kind of making moves after the pandemic that they might have otherwise made in the previous year and a half, but it's kind of really came to the fore, but kind of highlighted perhaps longer term trends that had always been there. So I think there's kind of maybe a need to kind of zoom out from kind of the what we're seeing right now and think about kind of, these are kind of policy questions that should be on policymakers' radars kind of over the long term. It's good that some of them are now in terms of kind of inequality between sectors, but it's maybe not specifically in the context of what we're seeing right now.
Thanks. Well, I'm now getting lots of questions coming in, so we're going to try and move to take some of them. And let me start with this one, because I think this is one which in some ways sort of has always puzzled me, something that's puzzled me somewhat over the last few years, and both of you and both of your organizations work on quite a bit. The question is, when inflation falls to 2%, will we get back to talking about widespread poverty? Now, as Xiaowei mentioned, over the standard measures of inequality, relative poverty, the Gini coefficient, and so on, haven't moved an awful lot either in the last 2 or 3 years, or indeed in the last 13 or 14. Yet I think most of us, even those of us like all three of us who tend to focus on spreadsheets and data, still look around and say, well, actually, the evidence in terms of homelessness, food banks, et cetera, is more than just anecdotal. There is a pretty clear rise in poverty and deprivation. How do we reconcile the data with what we think is actually going on, and what conclusions should we draw from that?
I think part of it might have to do with changing nature of work or changing styles of work. So we've seen this increase in agency work, solo self-employment, sort of more precarious forms of work that entail more income volatility. So it's possible that for a given amount of long-term income over the course of a year, if you have more volatile incomes, it's harder to manage to get by day to day. So you have these periods of intense hardship and therefore need to resort to food banks. I think maybe that's one way of sort of reconciling the data. It is, the data is a bit tricky on this, because actually, like, poverty rates have stayed pretty constant, which is not great. Generally, we expect poverty rates to fall, but we haven't seen this rise in poverty, and actually we've seen a sort of a fall in this material deprivation measure that sort of measures the extent to which households can afford essentials over the same period of time, when anecdotally at least there has been a rise in sort of food bank usage and sort of measures of extreme deprivation. So I don't know, it might be about the part of the income distribution you're looking at, it might be about volatility.
I think as well, it speaks to the importance, especially in kind of times like now when, things are changing really quickly, like lots of our kind of data sources, especially the ones we rely on quite heavily, are quite lagged, and it's good, it's useful to look at kind of different measures. So I think, I can't remember what the exact kind of dates were, but there was a stat, I think, from the Food Foundation that kind of food insecurity has doubled over kind of maybe the past year or so, and kind of there are kind of lots of if you piece together lots of different kind of timely evidence, then it's quite clear that we've kind of got a problem with as Xiaowei said, like food bank usage and that kind of thing. So maybe it's a prompt for us to kind of look at lots of different data sets in the round as well.
Yeah, I mean that leads on to another question, which was somebody asked, which is, does the recent adjustment to the ONS data give us cause for concern for the reliability of UK economic data more widely? And this is something that actually the three of us were discussing before we opened the discussion on do we trust our data on labour market, on jobs and wages and so on. And how much should we be worried that actually we seem to be, not just that as economists, not just are we notoriously unreliable at forecasting the future, we're not actually that good at measuring the past either.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of has implications on policy as well. I think my colleague Ben Zaranko has been looking at sort of asymmetric responses to updates on GDP figures, where basically if the outturn turns out to be better than expected, then the government spends, and if not, they don't contract spending in the same way, which over time ends up in systematic biases in government spending. I think, I mean, I've got the two of you on the line, so wonkishly, I think the wage data is sort of all over the shop at the moment. I don't know what you make of it, but I think it's actually quite difficult to say conclusively this is what's happening to the UK labour market. And I do sort of wonder whether some of the, more counterintuitive things that we're seeing are a product of poor data. But yeah, I don't know what you think.
What do you think, Hannah?
Yeah, we've also been kind of struggling to decide how reliable exactly we think the different data sets are. I think, again, like our kind of best way of coping with it has basically been to kind of, sense check between different data sets as much as possible, but it's certainly a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge, even kind of quality issues aside, obviously the stuff that's published can only ever be kind of, relatively high level, and that obviously hides lots of stuff that could be going on under the surface. So, it's obviously always important to kind of do a bit of digging when we have the kind of the granular data that sits beneath that. But yeah, definitely on the kind of on how good the data is, it's obviously the pay data is challenging. Even some of the kind of the headline kind of employment, unemployment, inactivity rates, kind of when you look at the kind of the headline ones that we normally see are averaged over 3 months, but when you look at the kind of single month estimates that sit beneath that, they're kind of, particularly at the moment, kind of really volatile. So it's definitely a case of trying to maybe take them with a little bit of a pinch of salt, especially if kind of we're seeing big changes from one month to the next, kind of bearing in mind that might not quite be the full picture.
We've got a couple of questions on the drivers of inflation. With various sort of hypotheses, for example, privatized utilities, the sort of profiteering by, or to put it in a more economic and less judgmental fashion, expansion of profit margins by large companies, which presumably have some market power to impose prices that would be higher than in a competitive market. One thing we've seen a lot about, and of course in recent weeks, is shoplifting, and which presumably, to the extent that it is an issue, whatever the causes of it, does impose a form of wedge between supermarkets costs and prices and so on. I mean, to what extent do we think that these sorts of microeconomic factors which presumably aren't necessarily going to go away, are big drivers of inflation, as opposed to sort of broader macro global, energy prices, etc., factors that I think economists have and most discussion has tended to focus on?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can give you a very good answer. I mean, I'll caveat by saying I'm definitely not a macro economist by background, but I mean, I think as best I've seen, it's very much, we had the big energy price rise, which was the kind of shock around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that's kind of been driving a kind of some knock-on effects with if energy costs are rising, producers, people producing other goods will, the cost of their inputs are going up, so that will kind of increase the prices of other goods as well. I mean, as far as I'm aware, I think there has, I think was it this morning that there was kind of some new kind of data on, like, competition between supermarkets has meant that food prices are actually starting to fall, albeit having risen by so much over the last year and a half or so, that it's kind of the small fall that we've seen is not, it's not quite good news per se, but I think I'm not aware of kind of lots of kind of concrete evidence that there's big profit or any bigger profit margins over the last kind of few months than there were kind of previously. But again, I could be proven wrong by someone who knows more about the data than I do.
I'm afraid I don't know more about the data than you do.
I mean, I don't think I know more about the data, but I think perhaps I am slightly more of a macroeconomist than either of you two. So what I would say, I think, is that by far the bulk of the rise in inflation was due to obvious, easily identifiable macro factors, mostly global, and by far the bulk of the fall that is in train and will continue, ditto. There is some microeconomic evidence, mostly not from this country, about things like profit margins and so on, which is hotly disputed. And I'm not going to discuss it now or try and, and then there are other things, shoplifting or whatever somebody else mentioned, Brexit, which is obviously a potential factor. I think my take would be that at this point, we don't know, and we would not expect to know, because those factors would become an issue and only become an issue and a problem if they lead to persistent stickiness in prices and in inflation, not prices, on the way down. And we've only halfway on the way down. So to the extent that those factors, and actually that includes everything from sort of lack of competitiveness in some product markets to the fact that actually there's a lot of shoplifting and law and order is, there's been a breakdown in the way which we enforce against leakages in the system, like shoplifting. All of those things are things which make the economy less efficient, less flexible, and hence you would see inflation falling less quickly as those macro factors subside. But we're not there yet. So if in a year we find that inflation has been surprisingly sticky despite continued weak economic activity and the absence of those macro factors, then we might conclude that there has been a sort of permanent reduction in the flexibility responsiveness of our economy, which makes it harder to squeeze inflation out of the system. And that could be due to lack of competitiveness. It could be due to Brexit, could be due to poor regulation of privatized utilities, letting them charge higher than prices than you'd have if those industries were competitive. All of those things could contribute. But I think, not only do we not know the answer to that yet, we don't know. We wouldn't expect to know the answer to that yet. So on that one, I think we'll have to wait and see. Back to other questions. There are a couple of questions on poverty and benefits and lower income families. Now, I thought it was notable that of course, well, perhaps not notable, perhaps you wouldn't have expected him to do so for political reasons, but the Chancellor, although he announced the increase in the minimum wage, there was nothing said nor briefed, as far as I can tell, either about pensions, where there's been a discussion in recent weeks about the triple lock, or about benefit payments to working age people, primarily universal credit and some disability benefits. What are the sort of choices and implications of those choices here?
So the question is, what are the choices around sort of the pensions and
both about
benefits?
pensions and benefits, where the policy would be to uprate them both by inflation, but governments have in the past chosen not to do that, or to do something different, which obviously would have impacts both for the fiscal position and for living standards.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the triple lock, I think it's, not controversial to say that, especially in this time since COVID, it's really, brought to the fore, just how much the triple lock benefits pensioners, right? We've seen these huge rises due to inflation, and now that inflation rate is falling and earnings are catching up, the triple lock is, probably going to be uprated by earnings, which just means that over a long period of time, we'll have pensioners' living standards outpacing the rest of the working age population by far. Sort of, linked to the fact that the state pension rate age is also rising, and our benefit system being relatively ungenerous. There's this big discontinuity between, people who are just below the state pension age, their living standards, and those who are just above the state pension age. So we've seen, and not a huge discontinuity in terms of their ability to work, for example. So in recent years, we've also seen a rise in poverty rates just below the state pension age. I feel like that is something the government will have to think about and sort out in the long term, especially if it keeps pushing up the state pension age. On working age benefits, I mean, I don't think I have anything enlightening to say apart from that. It would be a shame if they didn't rise with inflation.
Yeah, I definitely second that. And I think it's kind of worth, we've said it already in this conversation, but just to say again, the cost of living crisis has really been, it's low income households who are really at the sharp end, and state support has been it's been invaluable in making sure things weren't kind of even worse for those households. And I think not uprating benefits by inflation at this point, at this point in the crisis would just be it would be quite disastrous for lots of people's living standards. And it's worth saying, obviously alongside the kind of basic rates of things like universal credit, we have of course had other forms of support, the cost of living payments, and which have gone to some kind of benefit recipients as well. But it's worth bearing in mind that it's kind of those, I don't think we should see it as an either or, or giving these cost of living payments. So we don't need to be as worried about kind of not uprating benefits by inflation for lots of reasons, but not least because the kind of the cost of living payments have been kind of particularly targeted at the increases in energy costs. But it's worth bearing in mind that as the crisis cost of living crisis wears on, it's not just energy payments and energy bills that are putting household finances under pressure, but actually other essentials. I think at this, over the summer, we reached a point where the average food bill had increased by more than the average energy bill kind of cumulatively, but it's because people, especially low income people, spend a lot of their money on food. So it's worth bearing in mind kind of that people are struggling to pay for lots of essentials, and kind of holding back the state safety net in the way that not uprating benefits by inflation would be a bit of a living standards disaster on top of kind of all the all the other elements of a living standards disaster that we've seen so far. So really hoping that they don't do that.
The cost of living payments themselves are a response to benefits not uprating with contemporaneous measures of inflation, and instead being uprated with a lagged measure of inflation, right? So during a period of rising inflation that we've seen over the last few years, benefits are just lagging further and further behind actual costs, which is why we've had to have these temporary cost of living payments. And as Hannah said, it's sort of a sticking plaster solution. It's not an alternative to actually uprating benefits with inflation. And the IFS's analysis suggests that actually on average, the average household on means tested benefits is probably compensated by these temporary cost of living payments. But there's obviously huge variation because the cost of living payments are pretty much lump sum, right? You get a certain amount irrespective of your household circumstances, irrespective of your needs, which is extremely generous if you're a single person who's not renting. But doesn't go very far at all if you have a large family and high housing costs.
And just remind us, have the last cost of living payments been made now? Are there no more coming?
Not sure, is that? There's certainly nothing more announced for the next fiscal year.
Yeah.
I don't know about the exact timing of the payments.
I mean, I saw something saying that payments were going out now, and I wondered, or around now, and I wondered if that was sort of the last round of them, and that after this, there's nothing, which, sort of suggests that at least for some people on very low incomes, that this winter, despite the fact that inflation overall has, has fallen back and will fall back more, that for some groups in particular, this winter could be particularly unpleasant.
Yeah, exactly. I think the idea is that, if inflation continues to fall, we would expect real benefit values to catch up to their pre-pandemic levels in the next fiscal year.
Right, but that of course is not until next April.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so hence no more payments after that.
Okay, I'm going to take one or two more sort of, yes, and sort of just finishing off on the benefit system, several people have mentioned it. The announcement yesterday about, Jeremy Hunt's announcement yesterday about sanctions for people ostensibly not looking for work hard enough and or tightening up on disability benefit, incapacity benefits in some way. Are those likely to result in any sort of meaningful changes to the number of people who get jobs or to how much we spend on benefits?
So I think there's no evidence to suggest that toughening the sanctions system would encourage people to come off benefits in the sense of finding a job, rather than come off benefits in the sense of being discouraged by the benefit system and just disengaging from it with potentially disastrous effect on living standards. So, I mean, I think the DWP's own appraisal of evaluation of the sanction system suggests that it doesn't have a positive effect on employment. So I don't see why we would expect a positive effect on employment. I think in general, the UK leans very heavily on the stick rather than carrot when it comes to helping people find work. So it's very much, conditionality and sanctions rather than investments to facilitate job matching. So, I mean, I think Labour are possibly talking more in that direction, but it doesn't seem like the Tories are. On disability, what was actually announced on disability? I don't think I caught.
It wasn't clear whether there was a new announcement or simply a complaint that there were far too many people on benefits.
Just too many people on disability benefits. I mean, to be honest, that's also not surprising when you've got such a harsh conditionality regime for people who are not on disability benefits, right? That there'd be a shifting of the caseload towards disability rather than unemployment, which, is then potentially problematic in terms of moving these people into the labour market.
Hannah, anything?
I don't think that much. I mean, it's obviously the kind of it's kind of unsurprising that political kind of conversation is focused on people on disability benefits, just because of the sheer kind of the number of people who are not just kind of specifically on disability benefits, but also in the wider labour market figures, like not working because they are too kind of ill to work. But it kind of seems like this is it's an issue of like the prevalence of ill health as much as anything, rather than people just saying, it's not kind of about people claiming benefits and saying that they're too sick to work. It's to a large extent, at least as far as I'm aware, like it's just people have health conditions, and there are things that you can kind of do to support people and kind of make help them kind of find a job that might be suitable for them. But ultimately, the kind of it's if the root cause is poor health among the population, it's not clear that kind of punitive sanctions or kind of tightening up what can already be quite a kind of harsh process of assessing someone's, health and ability to work. It doesn't seem clear to me that that's the answer.
Yes, I mean, I think I would agree with what you both just said, and I think it's sort of quite important actually for us as labour market economists to get across the fact that there has been a sort of quite a shift in the way we sort of see these things. I think 10, 15 years ago, most of us would have said that there was pretty good evidence that a reasonably, that conditionality in the sense of fairly, a degree of pressure on benefit recipients to be active, to seek work, and so on, had quite positive impacts on the UK labour market over the period from sort of the mid 1990s to the 2010 or so. Whereas I think now, there's a pretty strong consensus view that we've gone well past the point of diminishing or indeed negative returns, where we've got to the point where conditionality simply forces people out of the labour market entirely, forces them to try harder and harder to get disability benefits and then to stay there because unemployment benefits are so conditional and so ungenerous that at this point we are actually having negative effects on the functioning of our labour market. And I think that's quite an important sort of message to try and get across to policymakers. So we've got a few minutes left, and I just want to finish on the one question, which is an obvious way to finish, which is that if you could implement one policy change to improve things, unspecified in the, but to let's make it general, to help people, improve, have better living standards, or to be more resilient to economic pressures, what would that policy change be? And in practice, you can have 2 or 3 or say what you like, but that's the sort of challenge. What would you actually do to make things better?
It's a small question.
Yeah.
I guess the issue is that, sorry, Hannah, go ahead.
No, go for it. You go.
No, I was also going to stall a little bit by saying that it's a hard question because there's so many different levels, right, at which you could make things better. So you could make things better immediately just by raising working age benefits, which, have lagged real earnings for a number of years, and are really quite ungenerous by international standards. And that would make a huge difference to people's living standards. Zooming out, though, I think the next government really needs to think about the growth agenda and how to actually get out of this productivity slump that we've been in for decades. And that's not, it's not one policy solution, but there's sort of a list of policy solutions that every economist reels off at every panel. But it seems more of a political economy question of why they're not implemented, right? So this is things like planning reform, having more infrastructure, having more long-term commitment that gives businesses the sort of confidence and incentives to invest. So I guess it's a mix of short-term fixes and longer-term thinking about growth.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Here at the Resolution Foundation, we're doing a big project called the Economy 2030 Inquiry, along with the LSE Centre for Economic Performance, which is very much about kind of the UK's twin challenges of low growth and high inequality. So kind of getting growth up, and then kind of, particularly through the benefit system, although not only kind of making sure that the gains from that growth are kind of equally shared. On some of the recommendations we've made around the benefit system, around kind of uprating benefits in line with earnings to resolve exactly that problem that Xiaowei mentioned, so that they kind of track earnings over the longer term, as well as kind of providing better support for people who are out of work, so that it's kind of a proper kind of cushion for people's living standards while they look for something else, as well as kind of just making sure the overall level is adequate. Then there's obviously, you could get into a whole kind of realm of labour market policies. We've talked a lot about the minimum wage, but some of other kind of policies around kind of stability of earnings, giving people kind of notice their shifts, like a right to request a contract with fixed hours if they're on a 0 hours contract, but in practice working 20, 30 hours a week or whatever it might be, which could have real impacts on people's living standards beyond just hourly pay. So not really narrowed it down very much, but there's lots of kind of things that we think should be kind of implemented kind of in the round, and kind of I think again goes back to kind of what Xiaowei was kind of saying about you want to kind of think holistically about your economic strategy and what you actually there's lots of different aspects to this policy kind of landscape, and lots of different ways to kind of support people's living standards at different points in their lives or kind of different situations that they might find themselves in. But it's kind of very much I think there's no kind of single I mean, there's lots of single policies that would make a lot of difference, and that should definitely, uprating benefits being an obvious one to start with. But I think ideally you'd want to kind of look in the round at kind of getting growth going again, and then making sure that that's actually benefiting everyone in society.
Well, I think that's a very good summary, and and we can end on that consensus. I think we all agree that in the short term, the single thing would have the most effect on actually people's everyday lived experience at the bottom end would be a decent increase in working age benefits. In the medium to longer term, you need a suite of policies that secure higher longer term growth. And actually, again, there is some, and it will be reflected in due course in the Economy 2030, I think some degree of consensus about those policies, which are around things like housing, infrastructure, planning reform, skills, and so on. As Xiaowei says, though, the problem in delivering them is not so much getting a few economists to agree on them, but actually the political economy challenge of actually delivering them, and the capacity of the UK governance and state to actually turn promises into facts on the ground, which sadly, as this week shows, has been lacking somewhat over the last decade. Thank you both very much indeed for a very useful and stimulating discussion. I hope you all enjoyed that and found it informative. We will hopefully see you next week for the next of our events. Which I should try and find out what it is actually before I sign off. Let me next. Well, we have various events around the Conservative and Labour Party conferences next Tuesday, next Monday with Wes Streeting. But the next lunch hour will be on the future of Scotland on the 17th of October 2023 with a variety of people, including John Curtis and Paula Surridge. Thank you very much, and we will bring it to a close then. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.